those who aren't aware, Klonoa is one of the more obscure franchises on the PlayStation 1 and it's quite the collector's item regardless of region, but finding a European copy is no easy task. I wouldn't say this game was all that expensive, especially when compared to something like Tombi, but trying to find Daughter Phantomile was a pain in the arse. Again, more so if you're in Europe due to its distribution and publication. I managed to get this from Amazon for £35, which I consider a bargain when many will pay a good 70 plus quid for this. Today I'm reviewing one of the many Klonoa games, Daughter Phantomile, which is the first of the series. The game was followed by a sequel called Lunatea's Veil, and there were several spin-off games including a volleyball game. Daughter Phantomile was released in June 1998, made by Pac-Man creators Namco and published by Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, the publishers of Medieval and Crash Bandicoot. The game had received fantastic reception upon its release, and often said to be better than the Nintendo Wii remake. I better apologise before I carry on, because I don't really understand a lot about this game. It's not the platforming that's not a problem, not at all. It's the world, it's the cast, it's the environments, it's pretty much everything that fluffs up the world. Even Klonoa himself is, well, hard to describe. I mean, seriously, I thought he was some kind of anthropomorphic cat, but I don't think anyone knows what he is, really. He's like something the Sonic team rejected, but after the DS games you couldn't really go much worse. But to be fair, he does look like a great protagonist, and he's certainly one I remember from many years ago. So anyway, the story goes that Klonoa is walking through some forest and stumbles across a huge ring of sorts. And no, maybe Knuckles will come back for it and retrieve it. It's apparently enchanted and holds some weird creature which helps him out. When Klonoa realises he's just experienced a bad dream, he wakes up and finds the ring nearby and starts his adventure, learning that the dream is coming true. The story isn't brilliant, but it gets better as time goes on. Anyway, the first thing you'll experience is just how fluent the control is. The jump is one of the most responsive I've seen in a platforming game, even sharper than Spyro. Nice work there, fellas. You use the X and triangle button to jump, but use the square and circle buttons to shoot from your... ring? Well, anyway, this isn't just your average projectile, as it works in a similar way to Kirby eating her foes. When you shoot, you actually pick up an enemy and blast them away in any given direction. You can launch enemies up, down, left or right, or even toward the screen or the background. This is a very clever mechanic that allows you to really see the 3D side of the game. Pandemonium, another 2.5D game, should have taken advantage of something like this, and even Tombi gets called out on this too. If you fire an enemy down, you can use them to perform a small flying manoeuvre, which allows you to remain in the air for a few more seconds. At least it works much better than in Jersey Devil. Along the way you'll have to collect gems, which thankfully aren't compulsory for progression. Every 100 you get grants you an extra life, and along the way you might find power-ups which multiply your gem gain temporarily. You'll also need to pop bubbles to gain certain buffs, checkpoints or captured natives, but depending on the contents you may or may not need to launch an enemy at them. Checkpoints appear as clocks, while gem multipliers appear as a dragonfly, and depending on the zone, the natives will change. I really don't understand the captured civilians, but I think if you get them all at the end of each level, you get a different ending. Seeing as you can't revisit all the levels, it's quite hard to tell. Klonoa can take 6 hits, but there's not much in the way of post-hit invincibility, meaning that it's quite easy to take a lot of damage in little time. Thankfully you can restore health with flying hearts, but these are an uncommon sight, so get used to watching your step. The enemies you'll face are real inventive, and there's quite an abundance of them in the very early stages. Each enemy will have different attacks such as projectiles, spikes, bladed shields, or even armour that prevents you from being grabbed. You need to exploit all the enemy weaknesses if you plan on grabbing them and killing them. My favourite enemy would have to be the monkeys from Vision 2-1, but they remind me too much of John monkeys, so let's move on before they start showing up. The first boss battle gave me great impressions of future ones, as the fight was dynamic, active, and the platforming required felt really good. Later ones become more difficult and require some thinking, but it's not too hard, and with patience and planning there should be very few problems. Speaking of difficulty, the only troubles I had occurred in Jugpot, the City of Water, where the game started to boast its potential. While there are hard parts of the game, you can choose to avoid them, as the game gives so many different paths to the end of a level, a very nice feature which should have been in more platform games at the time. I need to talk about the 2.5D aspect of the game, seeing as I really didn't cover it in Tombi. 2.5D is where the game is played like a 2D side-scroller, but the environments are in 3D and there's an emphasis on the camera moving itself wherever you go to a particular place. Examples include Disney's Hercules, Pandemonium, and even today we have Sonic Generations. One of the reasons why I was put off this game when I'd seen footage of it was because it looked similar to Tombi 2, and unfortunately that game did a horrible job of it. The control was shoddy, the environments were hard to distinguish, and there was no clear objective of what to do. Thankfully, Daughter Phantomile puts its foot down and actually makes sense of 2.5D, giving some jaw-dropping environments, puzzling routes to take, and more. Klonoa has hit the nail on the head when it comes to its level design, making a linear experience feel far less restrictive than they once were. In terms of visuals, Klonoa is a beautiful game with fascinating backdrops, environmental design, and character models. While the animation is somewhat choppy, I didn't really expect Donkey Kong Country. It's the gameplay that matters, I suppose, but I think you already know my views on that. The soundtrack too is one of my favourite things about the game, and I was overcome by a wave of nostalgia as soon as the theme booted up. Let that first song set the tone for the rest of the game. So that's Klonoa Daughter Phantomile. Now before we end this review, I'd like to wrap up my final thoughts. Klonoa Daughter Phantomile is possibly the perfect 2.5D platformer, managing to pull off the perspectives far better than any other of its kind. 2.5D is underappreciated, and that's easy to understand when it's so hard to do it as cleverly as this title. The gameplay is timeless with the right difficulty, fluent controls, interesting enemy and boss mechanics, as well as a character who has quite a few tricks in his arsenal. This is more than can be said for most platformers even today. What I didn't like about the game was its story, and while it does give you lots of it, I find it might be too much for someone who wants a casual platforming experience. The world is interesting, but we see too little of each stage to justify the reams of text we get. I also found the lack of way to revisit older levels underwhelming. Unless there is and I haven't discovered it, I believe this could be a good addition to allow 100% completion, as well as just enjoy the older zones but not start from stage 1. All in all, Klonoa managed to be both a good game and a good 2.5D platformer. So far, I believe it's the best of its kind, and it's also a Greasy gamer must-buy. Until the next time, I'm the Greasy Gaming #1 source for #2 games. Ta-ta for now.